The sun beat down hard on the military training grounds, dust rising with every boot that struck the earth, the scent of gunpowder still hanging in the air as recruits lined up in silence, their rifles clutched to their chests, their eyes wary of the man pacing before them, the commander, a figure whose voice could shatter confidence with a single bark, a man who had spent his life forging warriors out of boys and breaking anyone who dared to defy him, and today his eyes fell on her, the lone woman in the lineup, silver hair tied back, face smeared with the faint streaks of dried blood, and dirt, shirt torn from earlier exercises, chest scarred with a strange barcode tattoo that no one dared to question. Her presence alone felt like rebellion, like a storm waiting to break, and the men watched with bated breath, some smirking, others unsure, as the commander finally halted before her, eyes narrowing at the black rifle hanging loosely in her grip. "What is this?" he barked, his voice splitting the silence, a harsh laugh spilling from his chest as he yanked her forward by the collar, exposing her tattoo like he was peeling back a secret. "Don't bring toys in here, girl. This isn't a playground. This is a war zone." His voice roared across the range, veins standing out on his neck, spit flying, the other soldiers stiffening in fear of what might come next, some even smirking at the humiliation they expected to unfold, because for years they had seen him break the strongest of men with nothing more than words. But she didn't flinch, her eyes, icy and unyielding, locked on his as if daring him to push further, her knuckles tightening slightly around the weapon in her hand. The commander's grip was iron, his face inches from hers, daring her to speak, daring her to prove him wrong. But she said nothing. She only inhaled, her chest rising slow, steady, controlled, the way a predator breathes before it strikes, and then, in a motion so smooth, it was almost too fast for the eye to follow, she raised the rifle, her finger grazing the trigger with the confidence of someone who had done this not 100 times, but 1,000. And the silence of the range was shattered in a single instant by the thunderous crack that ripped through the air. The gun's report echoed like a storm through the valley, birds scattering from the trees, the earth itself trembling under the raw violence of the shot, and every soldier on the line jolted, hearts freezing, eyes snapping to her, then to the commander, and finally to the far end of the range where the bullet had struck, dead center, a perfect shot that split the bullseye into splinters, dust and fragments scattering like proof of her skill, proof of her truth, proof that the gun she carried was no toy, no prop, but an extension of herself, deadly, precise, and far beyond anything they thought possible. The commander froze, the fire in his eyes extinguished in a heartbeat, his grip loosening as the reality of what had just happened sank into his flesh like ice water, his jaw clenching, words failing him for the first time in years as he looked at her not with disdain, but with something new, something that felt uncomfortably like respect, though his pride fought to strangle it. The soldiers behind him were statues, their mouths half open, their eyes wide, their smirks gone, their certainty shattered, for the woman who stood before them had not only silenced their commander, she had silenced them all, her single shot rewriting the hierarchy of the entire range in less than a second. She lowered the rifle slowly, her face calm, unshaken, her gaze never leaving the man who had tried to strip her dignity away, and in that silence, the wind whistling softly between the trees, she finally spoke, her voice quiet but sharp, every syllable cutting deeper than any scream. "This isn't a toy, this is survival, this is war, and I don't miss." Her words carried through the air like a second shot, piercing through the pride, the arrogance, the doubt that had lingered moments before, and the men behind the commander shifted uneasily, some looking at her with awe, some with fear, all with the understanding that the balance had shifted forever. The commander's chest rose and fell, his throat working as he tried to summon the fury he was known for, but it was gone, swallowed whole by the bullet she had buried in the target downrange, and though his pride screamed for him to tear her down, his soldier's heart whispered the truth. He had just met someone who was beyond his reach, someone who had earned her place not by words, but by the weight of her fire, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, he released his grip on her shirt, his hand falling back to his side, his voice finally returning, rough and low, Fall back in line, soldier. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave the faintest of nods, not of submission, but of acknowledgement, sliding back into position with her rifle cradled like an extension of her own body. Her presence now heavier, undeniable, and the soldiers who had stood beside her now shifted with unease, no longer seeing her as the outsider, the anomaly, but as the quiet storm that could break them all if they ever dared to underestimate her again. The range, once loud with jeers and barks, now stood in silence, broken only by the distant hum of the forest, and though no one said it aloud, they all knew it. Something had changed forever in that instant, something that would ripple through every mission, every drill, every moment that followed, because the woman with the silver hair, the barcode scar, and the rifle that roared louder than any insult had just silenced the entire world around her, and no one, not even the commander himself, would ever see her as less again. She hadn't just fired a bullet into a target. She had fired it into their beliefs, into the walls of doubt and arrogance, and in its echo, the truth remained. She was no toy, no fraud, no outsider. She was a soldier, and she was deadly. And for the first time in years, the range bowed not to the voice of the commander, but to the silence of her gun. When the dust rises on a training ground, and the sun bears down like an unrelenting spotlight, every soldier is measured not by the uniform they wear, but by the fire that fuels their resolve, and in that moment where the air was heavy with silence and the smell of gunpowder lingered, the commander barked with the authority of a man who believed no one could ever shake his throne, his voice cutting across the field as he spat the words, "Don't bring toys in here." Each syllable laced with mockery, with the weight of his years of breaking men into machines, and all eyes turned to the silver-haired woman standing in line, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, her collar torn to reveal the barcode branded across her flesh like a mark of defiance, her fingers curled around the rifle he dared to call a toy, the weapon wrapped in strips of cloth that bore the scars of battles past. And though the other soldiers shifted, some smirking, some waiting for her to crumble under his wrath, she did not blink, did not falter, her gaze fixed on him with a calm that was far more dangerous than fury. The commander's hand shot out like lightning, gripping her shirt and yanking her forward as if to expose her, to strip away the last shred of dignity she held, his face close enough for her to feel the heat of his breath, his neck bulging with veins as he roared again, his words echoing like cannon fire, and yet she remained a storm contained, her silence louder than his rage, until in a motion so swift the world seemed to stop, she raised the rifle and fired, the crack splitting the air, a thunderclap that silenced birds, stilled lungs, and froze every mocking smirk on the line. Bullet slicing through the distance to tear the bulls, eye apart with surgical precision, fragments scattering as proof of her truth. In that instant the range ceased to belong to him, the commander who had built his legacy on fear, for it now belonged to her, the woman whose single shot rewrote the laws of respect in blood and gunpowder. And as the echo rolled away into the forest, the silence that followed was not weakness, but reverence, the kind of silence that only power can command, and though he tried to hold her with his glare, the fire in his eyes faltered, his grip loosening as the weight of what she had done sank into his bones, pride warring with the grudging respect clawing its way to the surface. Her voice then broke the quiet, not loud but sharp, the kind of voice that cuts deeper than a shout, and she said, "This isn't a toy, this is survival, this is war, and I don't miss." Words delivered with the conviction of someone who had walked through fire and come out unburned, words that branded themselves on the hearts of every man who stood witness. And in that moment they understood she was no outsider, no anomaly to be mocked, but a force forged from trials they couldn't imagine, a weapon wrapped in flesh and will, a storm that could not be contained. The commander's jaw worked, his chest heaving as if he wanted to unleash another roar, but nothing came, nothing but the faint rasp of air as he stepped back and muttered, low and rough, "Fall back in line, soldier." A concession not of defeat but of acknowledgement, and she returned to her place without a word, her rifle steady, her presence heavier than iron, and the range that once belonged to arrogance now bent beneath the truth of her silence. For she had fired more than a bullet that day. She had fired a truth so undeniable it shattered doubt, burned away pride, and carved her place into the stone of their memory. And from that day forward, the men would never forget that it was not the commander's bark that ruled them, but the echo of her gun, a reminder that respect is never given, it is taken. With fire, with courage, with the unshakable resolve of one who knows that in war there are no toys, only weapons, and she was one of them.